Stress is complicated, and the reason is because stress affects different people in different ways. Because it's not stress, it's response to stress that matters. Stressors are everywhere, but how you respond to stress is very individualized. So what works for one person may not work for another. What stresses one person may not stress another. What causes acute stress in one person may cause chronic stress in another. So stress gets complicated. There are two forms of stress. There's coping stress or adaptive stress or acute tolerable stress, and then there's chronic toxic stress. And those two are not the same, and they have very different effects on the body. It's often said, if it doesn't kill you, it will make you stronger. That's coping stress. That's acute adaptive stress. And what that does is, yes, it raises cortisol, but it raises cortisol in a short term, and it basically mobilizes blood glucose, it mobilizes lipids so that muscles can utilize extra glucose, so you can, say, run away from the lion in an acutely stressful situation. But then you come back to baseline, and you come back to baseline rapidly. Chronic toxic stress, on the other hand, is what happens when that stress persists for weeks. Like, for instance, your boss, or your mother with Alzheimer's, or your special needs kid. Those are chronic stresses that continue, and what happens is the cortisol just keeps coming and coming. It causes major changes in metabolic utilization. Any chronic toxic stress is a hypermetabolic state, and so you have to release more energy in order to be able to feed that hypermetabolic state. This ultimately leads to insulin resistance, hyperglycemia, and ultimately all of the chronic metabolic diseases that we have been discussing. Every single one of those is made worse by chronic toxic stress. Now, one of the things that has happened over the last 50 years is that we, as human beings who used to be able to do what we would call fear conditioning. Fear conditioning is like when you put your hand on a hot stove when you were 3 years old and went, ouch, I'll never do that again. And there was a learning component to that. Now, that same impetus will lead to chronic toxic stress and ultimately problems in being able to do stress management for a lifetime. And the question of what happened in those 50 years to convert fear conditioning to chronic toxic stress is the subject of multiple research articles and actually a book I'm writing right now, so I'm excited about it. So, having said that, what can you do to mitigate your stress? And the answer is, first of all, recognize what it is. The second is deep breaths. And the reason for deep breaths is because that stimulates the afferent vagus nerve, which sends information up to the brain, up to the area of the brain that controls fear, called the amygdala, and tells the amygdala that internally everything's okay, even when things on the outside seem not to be. Mindfulness, okay? Everyone's talking about mindfulness-based stress reduction. Living in the moment rather than living in tomorrow or in the or yesterday. Think of it this way. Anxiety is excitement about the future, but the future never comes, because you can be anxious about what will happen tomorrow, then tomorrow comes and everything's okay, but then you'll be anxious about what happens the day after, and then that day will come, and then you'll be anxious about what happens the day after that. In other words, if you keep focusing on the future, you can never get happy because you can't live in the moment. Conversely, if you focus on what happened in the past, you get depressed because you can't change, you can't fix what happened, because that ship has already sailed. The only way to mitigate stress is to actually live today and think to yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen today? And invariably, that worst thing is not very bad. And when you realize that, you'll get a lot happier and a whole lot less stressed. So that's my advice to you. Now, what can you do to mitigate stress? And the answer is, well, remove the stressor if you can. Not so easy in many cases because sometimes it's built into your home. The other thing to do is take a walk when you feel stressed, and definitely don't go to the kitchen. The kitchen is your enemy. Unfortunately, stress often breeds food intake. Okay, and so stress eating is a major problem in our society, and we have almost built that in, and we have made stress foods immediately available. The single best thing you can do if you feel stressed is to take a walk. Leave and reorganize your thoughts. It will take about 5 minutes. If you do that, you will come back, you will feel refreshed, and you will realize that whatever the stress wasn't nearly as bad as you thought. Easy way to combat stress: leave the scene.